Great. Well, hello, everyone. I am particularly delighted to be here in conversation with someone that I have actually a significant amount of reverence for, even veneration. These are not words I casually use, and someone who has been a stream of wisdom, certainly in the Buddhist tradition, with many, many widening ripples out into the larger world, the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. In a moment, I will say a bit more about him and then we'll jump right in. I'll say first that as you arrive in this online gathering here, we've had over 350 people register for it, and it's also being streamed out through various platforms. As you arrive in this technology that we use to connect with each other now around the world, you can let yourself arrive in your own body, in your own being, in the present, here and now, in your own place. And in that arriving, we can find a foundation that actually is relevant for our main topic here, which is to how to keep the heart open and to come from the heart. This is the way I'm going to be putting it here with my kind of California speak here. How can we come from the heart in the face of great tragedy, great outrage, atrocity, war, challenges, grievances? How can we stabilize our capacity to do that? And certainly one of the foundational factors that both modern science and ancient wisdom point to is the central importance of finding our footing. And one way and one place to find that footing is in the present, in this breath, in this moment, in this place, in this time, with others. And so with that as an invitation, I'd like to introduce my guest here, and certainly my teacher, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. So reading a bit of a biography here, which I actually have on a webpage. Here we go. So the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is an American Buddhist monk from New York City, born in 1944. He obtained a BA in philosophy from Brooklyn College and a PhD in philosophy from Claremont Graduate School, which I'll just mention in passing. You were probably getting your PhD about 10, 15 miles away from where I grew up in West Covina, California.
Oh, I know West Covina very well.
Yeah. Anyway, after completing his university studies, he traveled to Sri Lanka, where he received novice ordination in 1972 and full ordination in 1973, both under the leading Sri Lankan scholar monk, Venerable Balangoda Ananda Maitreya, who lived from 1896 to 1998. From 1984 to 2002, Bhikkhu Bodhi was the editor for the Buddhist Publication Society in Kandy, where he lived for 10 years with the senior German monk, Venerable, I always mispronounce this, Venerable Nyanaponika Thera, from 1901 to 1994, that person's lifetime, at the Forest Hermitage. He returned to the United States in 2002. He currently lives and teaches at Chongyan Monastery in Carmel, New York. Venerable Bodhi has many important publications to his credit, either as author, translator, or editor. These include the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, the Majjhima Nikaya, which I have read carefully, your translation, and as well as the connected discourses of the Buddha, the Samyutta Nikaya, published in 2000, and the numerical discourses of the Buddha, the Anguttara Nikaya, in 2012. I would want to add that one of the masterworks that Bhikkhu Bodhi, the Venerable Bodhi, has produced is In the Words of the Buddha, a kind of an anthology of the Buddha's central teachings with pristine, crystal clear translations. It's a marvelous, marvelous book. So in 2008, together with several of his students, Venerable Bodhi founded Buddhist Global Relief, a nonprofit supporting hunger relief, sustainable agriculture, and education in countries suffering from chronic poverty and malnutrition. I might add that I'm a donor to that good cause. I invite you to do the same if you like. And one of its major points of focus is girls and women. So, with all that said, and we could say a lot more about your very distinguished career and your many contributions, thank you so much for being here with us all with the Global Compassion Coalition.
Okay, I'm happy to be here.
That's great. So, jumping right in, you probably know the familiar parable that in our heart are two wolves, one of love and one of hate, and everything depends on which one we feed each day. I mean, the origins of that parable are a little fraught, but if we take it at face value, who among us does not have the capacity for that wolf of hate? I certainly acknowledge that. Yeah. And so through both the stream of Western science and biology and modern psychology, there's a pretty clear-eyed recognition of our very human capacity, as Professor Paul Gilbert, who is unfortunately ill and can't be with us today, has really championed the recognition that there's this extraordinary innate capacity in us for cruelty and callousness at all kinds of scales, including scales that we see in the world today in war-torn regions, the Middle East, the Ukraine, Myanmar, Somalia, and other places around the world. And so how do we come to terms with that part of ourselves? And how do we cope with it, drawing both on the wisdom streams that you stand squarely in and the modern streams of science, neuropsychology, evolutionary biology, anthropology, that I certainly have some familiarity with. So that's our topic space. And if it's okay, I'd like to just start by asking you to say how you understand compassion. How do you understand it? So let's start there.
Okay, so I could explain compassion maybe from 2 points of view.
Yeah.
One is what I would call a traditional Buddhist point of view. I'll start with that and then maybe then speak about my own sort of revision of that conception or elaboration of it or application.
How brave of you.
Yeah. Okay. When always has to be daring with traditions.
Very good.
Okay. So speaking from the classical Buddhist point of view, and I should mention that there are many different schools of Buddhism. So I can speak maybe from the standpoint of the tradition with which I'm most familiar, which is the Theravada tradition based on the Pali Canon and related texts. Other schools that I don't have such familiarity with might understand compassion somewhat differently.
Which I could just jump in. I apologize for interrupting. Just for a general audience, you're really talking about what people call early Buddhism.
Yeah.
Our best guess about what the Buddha taught and thought embedded in these scriptures that are handed down orally for several centuries before surviving texts occurred, including in the language called Pali, P-A-L-I, which you're deeply trained in and a great translator of. So in that kind of original roots and trunk of the tree of Buddhism as it's developed over 2,500 years.
Yeah. Okay. So in the Buddhist text, we actually have two words, at least two words that signify compassion, but two words that are primarily used in ways that could be translated compassion. One of these is karuna, and the other is anukampa. And so karuna occurs most often in a group of four qualities that are to be cultivated primarily as meditative states, though also implemented in our day-to-day life, in our day-to-day interactions with people. So the four states we begin with metta, which is translated as loving kindness or goodwill, the wish for people and beings to be well and happy. And then comes compassion, which it's defined as the quality that makes the heart of good people shake with the sufferings of others. So that is the way it's defined in the work of Visuddhimagga. And then comes the third quality is mudita, which is what I translate as altruistic joy. So that is rejoicing in the good qualities and the wholesome achievements of others. And then the fourth is equanimity or impartiality, looking at people or beings without discrimination or differentiation based on their relation to oneself. So here we have compassion embedded in this group of four qualities, in which sort of the foundation is loving kindness, because you start off wishing for people or beings to be well and happy. But the sad fact is that so many people, for various reasons, are not happy, either because of their own psychological conditions or because of social, political, environmental conditions. And so when you encounter people suffering, that causes the heart to shake. And sometimes we have to deliberately cultivate that quality from simple roots to strengthen it. And then when we see people achieving success and demonstrating, revealing good qualities, then we rejoice and we try to make the effort to look at everybody as equal without favoritism or preferences. So there we find karuna, where it occurs mainly as, I would say, a meditative quality. But then we have another word that is translated as compassion, and this is in Pali, it's anukampa. And the word anukampa actually has the base is kampa, which comes from the verb to shake, and the prefix anu means along with. So here anukampa is the shaking along with, but anukampa is not just used to signify an internal state, but it is compassion in its function of motivating action.
Aha.
Yeah. So it said, for example, when the Buddha gave the instructions to his first group of disciples to go out and start teaching, he says, go out and start teaching lok anukampaya, that is, out of compassion for the world.
Mm.
And sometimes, so in this case, anukampa, when you have compassion for the world, for the early monastics, they go out to teach the Dhamma. And then also we have when sometimes, for example, a monk might be sick, and then Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, might come to the Buddha and say, monk so-and-so is sick, please go to see him, anukampang upadaya, out of compassion. And then the Buddha will go to see that monk and give him some words of advice.
That's beautiful. And I've learned things already right now. It's a fantastic. If I could just sort of speak in a complimentary way about what you've said, in biological, neuropsychological terms, which the Buddha did not have access to, of course, 2,500 years ago, but we have learned a few things since about causes and conditions, including in the living body, that are relevant here. And just to kind of highlight three fundamental aspects of compassion that are consistent with modern neuropsychological views. One is that there's a perceptual dimension, there's a cognitive dimension in which there's an understanding of suffering, a recognition of it, but it's not merely conceptual in its second element, which is empathic. We shake with, we compat, it's compassion, with, and so there's that empathic dimension. But those two first dimensions alone, can be morally neutral. We can observe things and with indifference. We can empathically understand with bad intent toward others. In addition to that is benevolence, a positive prosocial orientation, which has its motivational quality. It's motivated to help. And as Professor Gilbert has pointed out, the evolution of compassion biologically arose through kind of a stream of, certainly in terms of mammalian and then primate and then hominin and then human evolution, very rooted in what's called the caring system, that is rooted in the biology of mothers caring for children, and then increasingly elaborated as childhood extended, so that the brain could grow to its full size over a longer and longer childhood. Mothers were increasingly dependent. There needed to be caring for the mother-baby unit, bringing in partners, and then increasingly in bands that needed to function together and be the village it takes to raise the child, et cetera. So caring is motivational, right? And Paul certainly really emphasizes that, which then takes us out into the world.
Yeah.
And much of your remarkable work has been about
Yeah.
engaged Buddhism, and we can
Yeah.
broaden that out to take our, to connect inner and outer, personal and political.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I wondered if you could speak more about your understanding and your approach with regard to compassion in action, both at the local scale of the person across, the dinner table or the room, and then all the way out, to the whole wide world.
Yeah,
You're
I'm not.
laughing. Uh-oh, have I
I'm not.
blundered?
Well, you see, one of the precepts that the monk observe is not to eat after 12 noon, so I don't have a companion across the dinner.
Oh, because it's past noon where you are.
Yeah,
But don't you get
maybe.
cheese and chocolate later in the day, maybe?
Yeah, but I'm alone, so in
Okay.
the building where I live.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Well, in your imagination, then, as
Yeah.
a hypothetical.
Okay. So this is where I mentioned before, sort of my own amplification or pragmatic application of the Buddhist teaching of
Yeah.
compassion. So I use a particular phrase or term to designate what I see as the kind of compassion that we need in the world today. And I
Mm,
call this conscientious compassion, in that it's a union of that primordial compassion that we have articulated in the Buddhist tradition with a sense of conscience, in the sense of the willingness to take responsibility for the well-being, for the fate of others in a world in which we face so much suffering, especially suffering that's inflicted by social, political, and economic forces. So I say that through compassion, we feel the suffering of others as our own, and we resonate with their suffering. But we don't remain just sort of in a passive role, generating the wishes, the thoughts, may all beings be free from suffering, may all beings be free from suffering. I have to say, too often amongst Buddhists, that is the approach that's taken. And I think that there is some positive power that's generated by the inner cultivation of compassion. But I also say that through the sense of conscience, it means that we are willing to take personal responsibility for the well being of others, to do something to transform the conditions of their lives, to take action that will actually help to rescue them from the abyss of suffering and to secure their well being, their safety, and their giving something that will give them the opportunity to live lives that are secure at the material level and also to unfold their own inner capacities and potentials.
mm. That's beautiful. And I want to highlight just what you said there about the moral dimension of
Yeah,
conscience,
yeah,
conscientiousness.
yeah,
Um, just as a detail, I'm thinking right now of Stephen Batchelor's translations of the last words of the Buddha, as best we know. Things fall, his translation, you may differ on technical grounds, I don't know,
yeah,
but just taken at face value, there's a lot about it that appeals to me. Things fall apart,
yeah,
tread the path with care. And I think of the two aspects of care as
yeah,
heart and conscientiousness.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And so you're bringing in this kind
yeah,
of the muscle, the steel, the
yeah,
fiber, the moral fiber
yeah,
of conscience, as you say.
yeah.
Uh,
And I would say that this conscience springs from I call it a commitment to justice.
mm,
So to see that, and the sense of justice, I say, is grounded on the premise that every person, every human being possesses intrinsic worth, intrinsic value, and inherent dignity, which must be respected by everyone and by the institutions that express our common life.
mm.
And so when we see people that their dignity is being violated, that they are being treated as disposable or dispensable and worthless, then through the sense of conscientious compassion, we have to sort of step in and transform those conditions that oppress people, dispose of people,
Yeah.
or just ignore them, and do things to affirm their own inherent dignity and to lift up the conditions of their lives.
Yeah. Well, I'm so really glad that you
Mm,
brought in the dimension of justice,
mm,
and just some so you know, and others who are listening here can know. Uh, Certainly, in the mission statement of the Global Compassion Coalition, that um, has been central for me,
mm.
is to establish compassion and justice
Yeah, yeah,
at the foundation of all societies. And we've actually had some internal discussions about the importance of adding justice. I
mm,
understand that
yeah,
in some areas the word justice is fraught because it's really an injustice
yeah,
system that incarcerates,
yeah,
the,
yeah,
the more people per capita in America than
yeah,
in any other country in the world, for
yeah,
example. But you're speaking here about true justice and the importance of, realizing that compassion and action must involve justice.
yeah,
And
yeah,
there's some beautiful quotations along those lines from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
yeah,
and
exactly,
others.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. If I could, so it's interesting as well. I just want to highlight, in your view, many people have focused on compassion at the individual level,
Yeah,
or in a very small scale, like building a compassionate classroom, let's say.
mm,
Certainly deeply important, wonderfully important to do. Uh, and still, many of the people that are doing that, me included, have the experience of basically pulling bodies out of a river
mm.
and repairing them and helping them set on their way, wi- while still needing to face the question of what is pushing all those bodies into the river in the first place upstream.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
What are the systemic,
yeah,
upstream,
yeah,
large scale injustices that are
yeah,
creating so much suffering that then we're trying to address individually? And so it's interesting that your vision and your
mm,
very powerful several essays
mm,
you've written really speak to the
mm,
larger systemic scale factors of
mm,
suffering
mm.
that behoove us, driven by conscience and the
Yeah,
motivation to relieve suffering, to do something
yeah,
about. And you've been very articulate about that. And I
yeah.
wondered if you could say more about widening our circle of the application of compassion to include systemic forces of suffering.
Hmm. Okay, here I think we have to really probe sort of deeply into what I call the systemic underpinnings of suffering that so many people are facing today. And
Yeah.
first, let us look at some of the manifestations of this called social suffering or collective suffering. So I actually, in preparation, I just for this discussion, I enumerated a few of them on a piece of notepaper. So I have probably the one which is most extensive, most widespread, and most maybe um, perilous in today's world is the climate change, which I now call climate destabilization,
Mm,
together with other forms of environmental damage. Okay, then first I just list them, and then we could sort of see the underpinnings of them.
beautiful.
So a second, I have poverty and economic disparities, vast disparities in wealth, whereby what is it, something like just a handful of people today own like half the world's wealth, and the bottom 90% own just a fraction of the world's wealth. And so with my organization, Buddhist Global Relief, like we focus on the problem of global hunger. And we have like more than 800 million people today, suffering from chronic, persistent food insecurity, and something like 200 million people on the verge of, starvation or severe, let's say severe hunger. Okay, so a third sort of manifestation of collective suffering is global conflict,
Mm,
in which we have, several hotspots in the world today. Probably the one which is standing out most conspicuously is the conflict in Gaza, the bombardments of Gaza. But we also have the ongoing war in Ukraine, which has now receded almost into the background, but it's still very, dangerous and causes a lot of misery for people. And we have countries like Sudan, which are not very prominent in the news, but There's a lot of, because of this military conflict in Sudan, there is a lot of people are homeless, displaced, in danger of severe hunger. And then Myanmar, which is, the source of so many Buddhist teachings and Buddhist practices, under a very repressive military dictatorship. So those are three. And then the fourth, which is in a way related to climate change and poverty, is the mass migration and the treatment of immigrants and the factors that compel people to leave their homelands where their ancestry goes back through beginningless time, and now they have to leave to come to other more benign climates and countries. Okay, so when we look for the underpinnings of this type of these manifestations of suffering, I find one of the common features is, well, at least one of the common features is an economic system which is based on the idea that the goal of the economy is the maximization of profit. Sort of that is the driving vector of the global economy. And that means when that is taken as the goal of the economy, that all other domains of meaning, domains of value, have to be subjugated to the pursuit of monetary value. So this means that the earth, which is the very foundation of our existence, which can be abounding with beautiful forests, clean, pure rivers, wondrous lakes, magnificent oceans, clean skies, clear skies through which we could see millions of stars shining at night. All of the resources of the earth just get turned into raw materials for producing products, probably 80% of them just relatively useless products, things that we just use temporarily and then quickly wear out and throw away to be replaced to new models, new designs. Okay, so we have the earth turned into a source of raw materials for production. People become treated as just workers who are to be kept to the minimum, whose salaries and wages are to be kept to the minimum possible in order to allow the executives and high management offices to make
fortune.
astronomical fortunes. Yeah. And so people are treated as either just workers to be disposed of when their labor is no longer necessary, to be employed at minimum wages, which are in this country really below true living standards. And also people are treated as customers, workers on the one hand, customers, consumers on the other. And so we have a culture dedicated to consumption, use, enjoy, and then dispose. The consumer society, which is also the disposing society, the throwaway society, creating more waste that pollutes the natural environment. And then even the arts, even spirituality or religion becomes subordinated to this consumerist culture. So we have these mega churches that cost millions and millions of dollars to construct, and they operate on the principle of people making lavish donations to support pastors and priests and ministers. And I have to say, a little sadly, in some cases, monasteries, Buddhist monasteries, that in which the residents live, far above the living standards of ordinary people.
So given this, and
Yeah.
that was quite a summary.
Yeah.
And facts do not have a political or partisan bias.
Yeah.
There may be other facts that are
Yeah.
important to include in our awareness of the whole, but the facts are the facts. And
yeah.
I think you've just laid out some very, very relevant facts.
Yeah.
And so taking all that into account,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Moving kind of increasingly into our focus here about what can individuals do in themselves and what practices can they engage, and in particular, how can they join with others, including at larger and larger scales that can be influential to address these systemic factors of suffering alongside addressing individual scale factors of suffering. In all this, going back to where I started, at least, with that second wolf in the heart, the wolf of hate. You're speaking about the importance, certainly, of the cultivation of the wolf of love, metaphorically, and kind of the whole wolf pack there, including the cognitive dimension, the empathic dimension, and then the moral, motivational, conscientious dimension. Okay, great. There's also this wolf of hate that, including, I would consider one of its aspects of, blind selfishness that is indifferent to the suffering of the others alongside you. The Buddha, as you know, wrote at length, taught rather, I should say, about ill will, and hatred is one of the three great poisons. Also, the casualness of harming others. And so here we have this kind of triad of, one of the three poisons or fuels of the fire of suffering, so-called hatred. Then we have ill will, and we also have a kind of, just casual harming of others. The Buddha spoke strongly about all three. Could you speak about those from a Buddhist perspective? And just kind of name these capacities, these tendencies, even inside us.
Yeah. Okay. First, I could mention those particular qualities, but also we could look into. I was going to continue on to, this global economy with its destructive impact is only one factor, but there are two other factors that I think, and these connect us to this hatred and ill will maybe more directly. Sort of the factor about the global economy shows the harmful impact of greed in causing a lot of suffering.
Yeah, certainly.
Greed, and sort of underlying that greed is ignorance or delusion, the idea that we can achieve some level of satisfaction just by accumulating masses of wealth. But two other factors I wanted to highlight. One, and this is emphasized very strongly in the Buddha's teaching, is the sense of identification. Identification first with ourself, taking ourself to have what we call a truly existing I. And that is the view of self, the belief in self, the clinging to the notion of self. And that establishes a kind of antithetical, oppositional relationship with others, so that we see ourselves in competition with others rather than as part of a common humanity. But also that sense of identification, and this is where it leads into more massive forms of suffering. It extends to groups. And so I see myself as a member of a particular group. So maybe at the national level, I'm American, and they are Canadian, they are Mexican, they are, French. So we have these different groups. Or I am a white person, they are black people. I am a follower of this.
Yes.
Okay.
Got it.
This party, they are a member of that party. I'm not a member of any party. Okay. Except a Halloween party. Okay, so we have this identification, both at the individual level, putting us into conflict with others as individuals, and then group identification. And that is, I think, what we see playing out in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And then another factor, maybe related, maybe not so directly related, is the quest for power, especially the quest for political power or maybe economic power. And I don't think Buddhism speaks so directly and explicitly about that. but one could still draw it out as an implication from the Buddha's teaching. Because when people see sort of this fundamental drive to get power over others, and when different people or different groups are in competition to gain the positions of power, that is what sparks hatred, ill will, and violence.
Well, I'm getting depressed just listening to all this. So, yes.
We could turn.
I think the facts are you've named
I don't like
them.
to be such a killjoy. I also have positive things to say.
Well, let's go back to that Halloween party. I always like the masks on, masks off, right?
Yeah.
So yes, okay, everything you're saying is true, and I think for me at least, what's humbling and important is to recognize inside myself the capacity for every single thing you've described, the capacity for hate, the default to ignorance, shrug, whatever, dissociation, I don't need to look at that, and so on. I've got some comforting delusions, I'm going to cling to them. The capacity for greed, capacity for identification, the capacity, the wish for domination. We're social primates, we live in dominance hierarchies a lot in our bands. So, I can relate to all that. So let's just kind of start on the inside, if we could. As we recognize these forces in us, and if I could add, I think implicit in many of the things you said was something I've observed a lot as a therapist and a social psychologist, the attachment to grievance. The ways in which, oddly, that being aggrieved, feeling mistreated, being angry about it, which is an unpleasant experience, can still be very compelling. Particularly including as a kind of a glue of group identity that then gets manipulated by authoritarian demagogues, as we've seen throughout history and at the present day. So that attachment to grievance. Okay, so we recognize these qualities within us. Let's start there. What's your advice? What's your personal practice? Because you've got human DNA as well. How do you practice with these qualities in yourself and these tendencies, these capacities, and how do you encourage others to practice with them?
Okay. You mean specifically with grievance, or just with any kind
you could be general. I think a general answer is useful, or anything that's real for you. How do we practice with these things?
I mean,
particularly using the power of compassion.
Yeah. Okay. What I found sort of very almost like necessary as a starting point for developing compassion for others is to cultivate what we would call a sense of solidarity. Almost like you put it pretty much your finger on it, that is the sense that we are all human, and beneath our differences, whether this on the individual level or differences in point of view, differences in aspirations and hopes, and at the collective level, the difference in our backgrounds, our historical trajectories, our nationality, ethnicity. We're all human beings. We have a common human nature. And what I found is a very valuable way to reflect on that. I had written an essay about that, which I sent to you for the Global Compassion Coalition website. This was a discovery that I made like years ago when I started to practice the loving kindness meditation. It's a discovery that the people that one is dealing with, either in everyday life or even just thinking about in meditation, that each person is a subject of experience. And so in that way, each person we can see ourselves as being we see ourselves as being subjects of experience. And by being a subject of experience, it means that like the whole world is spread out in front of us and converging upon us.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can recognize that for every person beneath all of their differences, for each person, the whole world spreads out in front of them and converges upon them. And so in a sense, each person is the whole world, contains the whole world within them. And so when we just reflect in that way, even without doing any kind of formal meditation, but it helps to break down those barriers that we construct between ourselves and others.
Yeah. Maybe Alex can put the link to that essay in the chat for people to see in the comments here and in YouTube recordings later and so forth. And one of the things that I took away from that essay is that when we have compassion for others, when we relieve the suffering of others,
Yeah,
we are in effect truly saving a world.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Each being is a world
yeah.
unto themselves. And this extends, of course, as you well know, to non-human animals.
Exactly, exactly.
The kittens, the puppies, the
Yeah,
birds, the bees,
yeah,
each is a world. Okay, so one thing we can do with these destructive capacities
yeah,
in us
yeah,
is to rest in an awareness of what people
yeah,
might call common humanity. We're all
yeah,
human,
yeah,
and that there is a world in
yeah.
others. Uh, and that awareness,
Mm,
yes, can calm down
mm,
anger,
mm.
vengeance,
Yeah,
selfishness.
yeah.
Okay. What else, may I ask? What's another thing you do yourself to grapple with these, the poison of hatred or the tendency toward ill will or, you know,
Okay, as far as, in
yeah.
my own life as a Buddhist, one of the main practices that I do is the meditation of loving kindness and
Oh,
compassion. So
yeah.
this is a deliberate attempt to cultivate these states inwardly.
Yeah.
And so we do the loving kindness meditation the way I do it and sort of teach it,
Hmm.
using sort of using expanding groups of people. So
Yeah.
starting with oneself, then one takes a few close people, close family members or friends. Then next group would be people like neighbors or colleagues
Mm,
at work.
yeah.
Then the people in one's town or city, or here, fellow monastics at the monastery. Then out to the country, and then out to the world.
Yeah.
Sort of, and then using certain phrases that sort of resonate and bring up that feeling of loving kindness. So I
Mm,
usually use four phrases, or sometimes focus on one or another of them. May so and so be well, in the sense of being healthy. May they be truly happy. May they be free from all, may they be safe from harm and danger. And may all their good aims in life be fulfilled.
beautiful. And so in that way, and I say as a genuine expert on this particular topic. It's one of the few
What?
I say this as a genuine expert on what I'm about to say, which is
Yeah,
one of the few things I actually know something about,
yeah.
positive neuroplasticity,
Okay.
a
Yeah,
repetitive
yeah, yeah.
enactment of a
Exactly, exactly.
practice,
Yeah,
yeah, a state of
yeah.
being,
Actually, yeah,
yeah, gradually becomes a trait,
exactly.
hardwired
Yeah,
literally into our
yeah,
bodies, into the nervous system. So
yeah,
that's really true. And a lot of increasing brain science is showing
yeah,
structural changes in people who do these prosocial practices
yeah,
of various kinds. They may not necessarily do it in the form that
yeah,
you teach. Cheech
yeah,
and I practice as well. They may
yeah.
do it in a Christian frame or a
Exactly,
secular
exactly.
frame or a,
Yeah,
Muslim frame,
yeah. It doesn't
Islamic frame.
require any kind
Yeah,
of
it's
belief.
whatever your practice
Yeah,
might be. You're
yeah,
cultivating something.
yeah,
I think of it as neurobhavana.
yeah,
You're
yeah, yeah,
developing something,
yeah,
and so along that lines, and this is something that's real for me and many people I speak with. We just get angry at other
yeah,
people. We get
yeah,
angry at the bad guys, whatever we
yeah,
think are bad
yeah,
guys, or they
yeah,
differ, or
yeah,
on
yeah,
the other side of the river, the other
yeah,
side of the aisle, the other side of the world.
yeah.
And so I wonder, and I hope it's not presumptuous of me to ask, do you ever get angry? Period. And do you ever get angry at the people that are doing stuff that hurts a lot of other people? And if so, what do
Yeah.
you do with your anger? How do you
Okay,
practice with that?
okay.
Because that's relevant to a lot of us.
Yeah, in my early days as a monk, early years as a monk,
Yeah.
and carrying over from my pre-monastic days, my pre-Buddhist days, I used to get angry very easily, very often and very easily. But I think through that practice of metta, of loving kindness over the years, I have to say, it's not boastful. I don't want to say that I'm free of anger, but anger towards individuals has gone down a lot, a lot, a lot.
Yeah.
But I do feel, first, a kind of anger when I see people who are taking actions on a mass scale that are hurting others. But
Yeah.
I distinguish, you see, Buddhism, the Buddhist texts always um, unconditionally, unreservedly condemn anger. But I think, you see, the quality that they're condemning, which is in Pali is koda or Sanskrit krodha, maybe the English word anger can have some connotations that are not exactly corresponding to krodha. So krodha, anger in that sense, where you are emotionally overcome and driven and sort of dominated by that surge of emotion, that is the unwholesome state. But I say that there is a kind of, maybe a moral, I could use the word outrage, which doesn't mean that you're in a rage.
Correct.
I just don't know another word to
That would
use.
be my word as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a kind of strong moral revulsion or opposition or resistance to certain kinds of behavior.
Yeah. I would think of the one as destructive rage,
Yeah,
the other being a kind of moral fill in the blanks, outrage,
yeah,
healthy disgust,
yeah,
at that which is
yeah,
an atrocity or
yeah,
abhorrent, fieriness. I think
yeah,
it's important, in my opinion, that particularly for people who I think have very legitimate anger
yeah,
at how
yeah,
they've been mistreated or how those
yeah,
they
yeah,
care
yeah,
about are being
yeah, yeah,
mistreated and have had their legitimate anger dismissed or downplayed or
yeah,
patronized or even punished.
yeah,
Women as a class, in
yeah,
terms of gender socialization, you could say that too. I
yeah,
think it's very important to be careful about. We're not speaking here about suppressing
yeah,
a
yeah,
clear seeing. Anger has its functions. It's clarifying, it's energizing, and all the rest. But as
yeah,
you know, the proverb, my version of it, anger with its honeyed tip and poisoned barb.
yeah. That is the kind of, that is coda or crota. That is the anger to be eliminated.
Yeah,
But if you like look at some of the speeches, the recordings of speeches by Martin Luther King Jr.,
yeah,
he's not speaking in sweet, gentle words. He's
yeah,
really speaking forcefully
yeah.
from a very strong moral position.
Great, Greta Thunberg at the United Nations on the
Yeah, yeah,
climate.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
the outrage
yeah,
of
yeah.
you know young people. Yeah, yeah. So there's a place for that. So, but
I think
yet
so. Yeah,
a little detail. I don't know if you know this. In our brains, think of the four major so-called negative emotions:
yeah,
sadness, fear, shame, feelings of inadequacy, and anger.
yeah,
Sadness, people don't like feeling sad typically. They don't like feeling anxious. And these are on a range of intensity. They don't like feeling ashamed or remorseful or
yeah,
guilty. It's unpleasant. But anger, unlike any of the others, releases reward molecules in the brain
yeah,
when the first surge of anger comes.
yeah,
Dopamine and norepinephrine are heightened in your brain.
yeah,
That's the honeyed tip.
yeah. That's the honey tip. Yeah,
Alongside very often
yeah,
of a lot of self-referential righteousness. So we
yeah,
have here
yeah,
too one of the factors you said about
yeah,
selfing,
yeah,
the tendency towards self, and then getting caught up in our case against others and our grievances against them and so forth.
yeah,
So there's something really important for me, I would add, to the cultivation of loving kindness and compassion
yeah,
and a sense of common humanity, a kind of jaundiced view of anger,
yeah,
that also in the proverb from Buddhism,
yeah,
getting angry at others is like throwing hot coals with bare hands. Both of
yeah,
us get burned,
yeah,
and for
yeah,
me, it
yeah,
was helpful to realize
yeah,
anger was an affliction on me, even
yeah,
though it felt so
yeah,
righteous
yeah,
and
yeah,
justified, but it
yeah,
hurt me to
yeah,
get mad at them. Yeah.
yeah.
You want to
Yeah.
add to any of that in your own
Yeah, when I
practice?
was a young monk, yeah, first I was ordained actually in the Vietnamese Mahayana tradition when I was in graduate school. And I was living with my teacher, a Vietnamese monk, and sometimes we would have disagreements about Buddhism, though I knew very little about Buddhism. But I would always grasp hold on my opinions and sort of argue forcefully against him, and I would get angry when he would contradict me. And then he taught me like one theme for reflection. He said that I should do this every day, even if there's no dispute going on, but just at the beginning of the day, just to sort of prepare me for the rest of the day. The sentence goes, I might be right, I might be wrong. What's important is not to be right and not to be afraid of being wrong, but to investigate and find out what is the truth.
Hmm. How's that working for you?
Yeah,
As
it
Dr.
worked.
Phil would
It
say.
worked quite well. It worked
That's
quite
great.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I can see the benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, related to that, one of the things that's very alive for many people, certainly related to conflicts in the Middle East,
Yeah.
uh, as well as elsewhere, is how to talk with others
Yeah.
who are on the other side of the
Yeah.
river, the other side of the aisle. And I want to just go build on what you just said there about the
Yeah.
value of discovering the whole truth,
Yeah. Yeah.
all the parts of the truth, and seeing the whole,
Yeah.
right? And so, um, in terms of that which can come up inside us when we
Yeah.
get angry at others who
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
not include our true part of the whole,
Yeah.
or who are, pounding away at their part of the whole, but leaving others things out, or, we're angry at them about that, or we're upset about that. What are some practices we can engage inside ourselves with others that with whom we disagree vehemently?
Mhm. Okay. What I would say as a starting point is not to immediately start arguing against others.
Mm,
We'll call this the opponent from
yeah.
impulse. But first, pause for a moment before responding, and then try to collect one's mind so that one can speak gently, firmly, or gently, kindly, but firmly, firm in one's position, but not tenaciously grasping one's position and
Mm,
thinking that you have to be the victor in this. Don't try to turn a discussion into a debate, but always try to keep the conversation at the level of a discussion rather than a debate.
mm,
But often it might be difficult to do that because the other person might be in the debating mood and feel that he or she is compelled to get the upper stand.
yeah.
And
Well,
so
what?
if that happens, if the discussion gets heated, then maybe you have to tell the other person, let's pause for a moment, quiet down, and let's try to discuss this on friendly terms,
Mm,
trying to find some grounds for consensus, at least as a starting point. But sometimes you'll reach a point where you don't come to agreement. At that point, you just have to reach an agreement to disagree, but do so on friendly terms, not using the disagreement as a ground for turning that into a feeling of enmity
yeah.
and resentment towards the other person.
Mm. I think of the phrase from diversity work, no enemy images.
Yeah,
And that is in reference to people who've been historically
yeah,
horrifically mistreated,
mm,
but the value for them in not framing things as the enemy, right?
mm,
There may be the opponent, there may be the adversary. You may
yeah,
see, their intent with discernment. You can see the incentives
yeah,
that are going to continue to maintain their way of being, but you don't have to
yeah,
frame them as an enemy. I think of
yeah,
a teacher of mine, Gil Fronsdal, who talks about we may need to put people out of our company because they don't come to work
yeah,
or bed,
yeah,
uh, we may need to put them out of the halls of power,
yeah,
but we don't need to put them out of our hearts.
yeah, exactly. That's very good. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I wonder again, how can we practice with, and how do you practice with that moment where, with clear seeing and discernment, you realize, wow, what the real intentions of that other person or group are, what they're committed to, and they're not going to budge. I think for many people that's actually wrenching when it happens in their family systems.
Yeah.
We're moving into the holiday period in America where we have gatherings with family and in-laws and Uncle Bob, and
Legendary Uncle Bob.
yeah, and and I think for many people it's a real difficult moment when they realize, wow, something I care deeply about,
Yeah.
like justice,
Yeah.
they just don't care about, or something
Yeah.
I care about, which is appreciating the underlying root causes of
Yeah.
conflict in the region.
Yeah.
They are so identified with their own particular tribal grievances,
Yeah.
they have no interest in that recognition of the whole. I'm not leaving their part out. I'm just advocating that we see the whole. Nope.
Yeah.
Zero interest, right?
Yeah.
Or, the classic line, it's gendered, from Upton Sinclair, you cannot convince a man of something that it is his paycheck not to believe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So with compassion in your heart and a sense of
Yeah.
common humanity,
Yeah.
what do you do when you realize that they're not going to budge and they're, going in a different direction than you are?
I say, join one's palms together
Well, that's good.
and just keep silent. No, I mean that seriously. I mean, if you can't move somebody and you see that they are tenaciously attached to their own position, then you just have to shift the conversation to nice weather we're having today, or if it's close to Christmas time, gee, I hope we have a nice snowy day. Well, in California, you won't get that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's beautiful, actually. And as well, do you also look for others with whom you can make your sangha, with others with whom you can join in common cause, rather than continually struggling to try to get blood from the proverbial stone?
Well, I think in the situation you described, the interaction with the other person is inevitable. Like you're at the family.
Or more broadly in the world,
Yeah.
I think people can sometimes get caught up in trying to convince others. And as my son tells me, Dad, don't feed the trolls.
Mhm.
Look for the people, who see it your way. Look for the
Yeah.
people who, wisely you can join in common cause with, rather than banging your head
Yeah,
against
I
them.
would say so. Though I
Yeah.
don't think that one should always just confine oneself to the people that one agrees with. But if you find
Yeah.
people with different points of view who are willing to discuss issues in a calm, respectful way, then you can have the discussions in order to sort
Yeah.
of broaden your own point of view. But when you um, run up against those who are obstinately and tenaciously attached to their point of view and won't budge even a fraction of an inch, then you just have to drop the conversation, speak about other things.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have about 10 or so minutes here left. And certainly those who are watching, I invite you to put questions or comments into the chat, and we'll see if we can speak to them. Now that we've focused for, a good while on the individual level,
Yeah.
personal practice,
Yeah.
you named a number of systemic
Yeah.
sources of suffering.
Yeah.
And we've also talked about the importance of
Yeah.
extending the circle of our compassionate action
Yeah.
out, eventually, including
Yeah.
to address those systemic sources of suffering. Do you have any particular headlines about that or suggestions that go in that direction?
Can I just take a 1-minute break? It's something
Yes,
that comes to me because of my age.
yes,
Okay.
please.
Okay. I'll be back
I'll
in a
put my own hands
Okay.
together,
Okay.
and actually, I'll invite those who are present
Yeah.
during this little break
Okay.
to let whatever's been useful for you here to settle in. Whatever's useful, whatever feelings, ways of being in your body that have come to you, letting those kind of sink in so you can take, the fruits of this conversation with you wherever you go, letting it land inside. You may, in particular, be interested in the practice of widening the circle of caring, um, beyond the groups we identify with, as the Venerable talked about. I know for myself, I feel heartened and inspired by this conversation, and have the sense of the importance of simply doing what we can. There's so many big issues out there in the world. What can we each do? Right? And we can, find a kind of peace as we look at the big problems of the world and go, well, I'm doing what I can in my own circle. I'm planting the tree that I can plant. I'm having a compassion-centered conversation with someone. That's what I can do. I'm being kind to myself. Of all the worlds we save through compassion, those worlds include our own. Bringing support and compassion to ourselves, knowing that we can do that. It's interesting that there's a moral principle that our responsibility is in proportion to our power. Well, who's the being over whom we have the greatest power? Our future self. And therefore, as a being, certainly, we have a very significant duty to. How can we support ourselves through compassion and save the world that has our name tag? So these are really good things, I think, to reflect on.
Okay, I'm back now.
Perfect timing. So, question on the table. Large-scale systemic factors. You named a number. You named poverty. You named the climate crisis. You named wars. You named fundamental, the profit economy, capitalist model in the world. Utterly different from the ways in which the economy in a hunter-gatherer band is, in which there's little you can possess, is rooted in caring and sharing, as Professor Gilbert has talked about, which is compassion and justice. Those two, side by side, so different from what we think is natural, but is profoundly unnatural in the global economy. Okay, what are some of the things we can do about those systemic factors of suffering?
I say two ways in which we can address these problems. Okay, the first way is a way which can more immediately bring some benefits and transformation, and that is by aligning ourselves and joining organizations, movements, projects that are intended to bring about some kind of change or transformation in the quality of people's lives. For example, if I could do a little self-advertisement for the organization I founded together with my friend.
If you didn't, I would. Buddhist Global Relief.
Buddhist
So
Global
please
Relief.
do.
Yeah, so back in 2008, we decided to form a Buddhist relief organization, and we decided to focus on the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition around the world. And so we started with a few projects along that line. And then we found that, it's not enough just to provide people with food, but it's necessary to look into some of the roots, the underlying roots of poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. And two of the roots that we found related is the subordinate status of girls and women in many traditional cultures. And so the way to at least to lift those people out of poverty and give them greater economic security, one is promote the education of girls, and the other is to sponsor projects that help women to start right livelihood projects to support their families. Yeah, so joining together into organizations that help to alleviate suffering at the level of charity, humanitarian service, and many different forms. What I say is for people to look into their hearts and find what is it that really moves one, what sort of causes the heart, the strings of the heart to resonate, and then align oneself with that organization, project, whatever it is. Could be animal welfare, could be joining an organization addressing climate change. And so when there are many, many organizations, little organizations working maybe differently, but having a common spirit, that could gradually bring about some transformation. But also what I say, that's the first prong. The second prong is it's necessary for us, and here I'm stepping on a little third wire in Buddhist, a third rail in Buddhist circles, is it's necessary to be political, which doesn't mean that you join a political party or um, become a politician, but we have to get acquainted with the major issues and what are the underlying sort of agendas of different political parties and different political groups. And in order to come to a clear understanding of these sort of forces at work in our own country, in the world at large, you will also need access to reliable sources of information. And this is reliable, trustworthy sources of news and of commentary on current events. Because there's a lot, the reason why we have such people living in these sort of political silos, each following their own vision of the world, is because they're checking into different sources of news. And some of these sources are just presenting a very biased, narrow, or distorted point of view. Yeah, so it's through
Thank you.
correct understanding that we can know who are the political figures that are working, that are sort of seeking to create a better, more just, more sustainable world, and which politicians are just working as sort of agents of powerful interest groups that don't really care about the welfare of people.
Yeah. Well, those are wonderful
Yeah,
things that we can do as
yeah,
individuals, look for those who are helping in ways that touch your heart and help them, help others, obviously. And,
mm,
um, you know, take based on
yeah,
conscientiousness and
yeah, yeah,
caring, uh, that can see the whole,
yeah,
open into some sense of responsibility for civic engagement,
yeah.
which I think is nonpartisan.
Yeah,
Uh,
civic engagement, that's a good expression.
yeah, including voting,
Yeah,
and realizing that there really are consequential differences,
major.
particularly in countries in which policy is, it's 48-52, 49-51.
Yeah,
Either way, these
yeah,
are tipping points.
yeah,
And yet on either side of that tipping point, that it's, it's up or down, it's left or
yeah,
right. It's quite
yeah,
binary in terms of
yeah.
the actual consequences of those
Exactly.
tipping point elections. You can decide for yourself which side you favor, but be aware that fairly small shifts in voting can actually have enormous consequences.
Yeah,
Um, so, just to use a brief example, you're probably aware of in America in the election in, I think, 2016, Hillary Clinton against
mm,
Donald Trump. Just statement of fact,
yeah,
Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in America by about 2.8 million people,
yeah,
nearly 3 million people. And yet, three states
yeah,
determined the election in the Electoral College by a margin of 78,000 votes. 78,000 votes in, I think,
mhm,
Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, maybe Michigan. 78,000 votes. So things matter. Now, maybe you're
exactly.
glad whichever way it turned. I'm not arguing one way or another in this setting, but I'm just pointing out the fact
Yeah,
on the ground.
yeah,
Absolutely. Um, so those are really good things, certainly close to my heart when I think about coalitions
yeah,
forming.
yeah,
Yeah. And I know we're going to be finishing up here, and maybe a good way to bring it home is to build on a question that came in from Winifred. Um, she writes, to shake with others as a expression of compassion. What a beautiful metaphor.
I
To
see.
shake with others.
Yeah.
The trouble is that I am too shaken to the
Okay.
point that I feel physically
Yeah.
unwell, hypersensitive, hard
Yeah.
to overcome that. I think
Yeah.
about the intersection of equanimity, one of the four
Yeah.
Brahma Viharas, and
Yeah.
compassion,
Yeah.
foundational. So how can people practice
Yeah.
in ways in which they open their hearts, but
Yeah.
are not so overwhelmed or
Yeah.
flooded that
Yeah.
they suffer more and
Yeah.
can't help they can't be
Yeah.
helpful then when they're so flooded.
Yeah. That's a very good question. That's a very good question.
Other people have seconded that question, like Leslie and so forth. Other people, yes. Okay.
Yeah. In that case, I would say that one needs what I would call an inner refuge, an inner island to which one can, into which one can withdraw, so that one can sort of face the suffering of the world, but to do so from a position of equanimity. And so what I always find is sort of maybe I call this the base from the common base in meditation practice and base for my own practice is the mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of the breath. So when you feel like the emotions getting too too stirred and the mind is tending to go into a state of emotional turmoil or agitation, then one can just sort of go back inward into the breath. And even if those emotional states arise, what one does is to turn them into objects of awareness instead of letting them operate in the back of the mind so that they're pushing you forward.
Mm.
You put them in front of the mind's capacity for observation. And so when the mind gets emotionally shaken, so you just, you have the breath as a foundation, but then you just look mind agitated, mind shaken, mind in turmoil, and just you could watch that state and just observe it, turning it into an object and just watching it. And then as you watch it, it sort of loses its disturbing force and sort of dissipates like a cloud.
Mm.
And then when
Beautiful.
you come out, then you can draw upon the power of that shaking of the heart.
Mm.
At least once you get trained in this practice, you could draw upon that to
Yeah.
generate that strong motivation to action, but without being emotionally torn up by that state.
Mm. Mm.
That's
Thank
from my
you.
own experience.
Yeah. 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 Um, Thank you. Just a couple things that I would just might offer to that are very much aligned with what you said. Just neurologically, the process, as you say, of tuning into breathing brings us in touch with the ongoingness of our livingness, which is reassuring. We notice, as I describe it, that we're basically all right now.
Yeah,
Brings us into the present. Neurologically, that interoception reduces activity in the default mode network
yeah,
of the brain, which is caught up in the future and the past with a lot of self-referential
yeah,
ruminating. It's like a circuit breaker to
yeah,
tune into internal sensations that are
yeah,
neutral or positive. Yeah, just that alone is kind of really helpful.
yeah.
Yeah,
And just sort of, well, the breath is just one thing, but centering awareness in the body, you could go
yeah,
from the breath to the whole body awareness.
yeah.
And when you
No, that,
just sort of
yeah.
settle mindfulness of the body in the present.
Ah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Um, well, as we finish here, wow, what a rich conversation. And I wondered if you had any final comments or blessings for us.
Okay, well, I say that sort of the task that confronts us today, whether we are whatever religious, spiritual tradition we're following or no tradition at all, but I say that sort of the task that I always say is it's the theme that we used for our BGR discussion a couple of weeks ago. The task is to create a world that works for everyone. And that should be sort of the ideal, recognizing that we're probably in our lifetime maybe never going to reach that ideal, but that should be the sort of ideal of aspiration. And to move towards that ideal, we have to combine two things, I would say. One is inner cultivation, inner transformation, by taking up some kind of spiritual discipline that will enable us to, to deal with the mental afflictions, like we say, greed, hatred, anger, ill will, violent tendencies, and to transform them into generosity, kindness, and wisdom. So inner transformation, but also especially incumbent upon us today is to apply our inner development to outer transformation, to take at least some steps towards creating I would say, an economy based on a principle of maybe perfect equality could never be established, but at least an economy in which nobody has to sink into degrading levels, and to create a world of peace and environmental sustainability. So that is what I would say is our task.
Yeah. Well, it makes me happy that you are engaged in that task in this world. And certainly it's a task that preoccupies me as well. And I want to really, really thank you at a very personal level,
Thank you so
Venerable.
much.
Very personally, I've gotten so much
Yeah.
from your work, and I would say the courage in it. And as you said, I think the word bold or daring, I think that was your word. We need to appreciate tradition, but be daring. And also certainly Buddhist global relief. That's something for people to really investigate and learn about. Extremely effective. 91% of the money coming to that organization goes directly to highly leveraged projects around the world that really help a lot of people immediately, while simultaneously, including in the education of girls, for example, are planting seeds for a much better future. So Buddhist global relief. Thank you. Really.
Okay,
thank you. Thank you
enjoyable
very much. So glad you're here. And thank everyone for participating.
And if you're in contact with Paul Gilbert, please give him my best wishes.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Paul's had a bit of a bumpy ride, but he's turning a corner here.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Yay. Many bows.